Marseille, 1951. The city had survived the war, barely. And in the space left behind, by the Germans, by the collaborators, by the broken economy, certain men had moved in. Not quietly, but carefully. The port of Marseille was the largest in France, and in the post-war years, it was something else too. It was the exit point for nearly 80% of the heroin entering the United States. That number is not disputed. What was disputed for years was who controlled it. The answer, according to French police records and later American DEA investigations, pointed to one family, the Guérini brothers, Antoine and Barthélemy, Corsicans by birth, Marseillais by choice, and criminals by calculation. This documentary is based on historical records, court documents, and investigative journalism. Where evidence is incomplete, it is clearly marked as such. To understand the Guérinis, you have to understand Corsica. The island sits in the Mediterranean French territory, but culturally apart. Tight communities, old loyalties, a tradition of what locals called simply the milieu, the underworld, but the word sounds almost dignified in French. Antoine Guérini arrived in Marseille before the war. He was not a man who announced himself. He built connections with dock workers, with local politicians, with the men who ran the gambling dens along the waterfront. By the time the Germans occupied France, Antoine was already embedded, and the occupation, in a way, was useful. Here is where the history becomes complicated. During the war, the Guérinis aligned with the French resistance. Antoine provided shelter, forged documents, and according to several post-war accounts, ran weapons for the Maquis. After liberation, this made them heroes. Or at least, it made them untouchable. The post-war French government had a problem. Communist dockworkers in Marseille were organizing strikes. Port operations were shutting down. American Marshall Plan supplies were being blocked. Washington was watching. And someone in Paris, the exact chain of authority remains disputed, reached a decision. They would use the Guérinis. Antoine's network of waterfront loyalists broke the strikes, violently, in several documented cases. In exchange, the Guérinis were given something invaluable: space. The French government, or elements within it, looked the other way. And in that space, the heroin trade was born. This arrangement, organized crime used as a political tool, was documented decades later by American journalist Alfred McCoy in his 1972 investigation, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia. McCoy's research is considered one of the most thorough examinations of the early French connection. He concluded that the CIA, through intermediaries, had facilitated the arrangement, not as drug traffickers, but as anti-communist strategists who accepted the consequences. The direct CIA involvement remains disputed in the historical record. McCoy's thesis is accepted by many scholars. It is not universally settled. The mechanics of the trade were precise. Raw opium moved from Turkey through intermediaries in Lebanon to Marseille's clandestine laboratories. There, Corsican chemists, skilled, discreet, and highly paid, refined it into heroin of unusual purity. Then it moved again into the United States. Between 1950 and 1970, an estimated 80% of the heroin consumed on American streets passed through Marseille. That figure appears in multiple U.S. congressional records and FBI reports from the era. Tens of thousands of addicts, in New York alone, fueled in part by decisions made in the harbor of a French port city. Antoine Guérini, by most accounts, did not live extravagantly. He owned property, he had connections, but he was not a man who put himself in the newspapers. That was the point. A French investigator who studied Antoine for years was once asked what made him different from other criminals. The investigator paused before answering.
He never needed to threaten anyone twice.
That was all he said, but nothing protected forever. By the early 1960s, the machine Antoine had built was showing cracks. Younger men were pushing for larger shares. Alliances were fragmenting, and the American pressure through Interpol and the Bureau of Narcotics was intensifying. In June of 1967, Antoine Guérini was shot and killed in Marseille. He was at a gas station. He had stopped to make a phone call. The killers were never formally identified. The case was never officially closed. His brother Barthélemy survived him, but only barely in practical terms. Barthélemy was arrested, tried, and convicted in 1970 on charges related to organized crime. The Guérini era was ending, but the machine they had built did not stop with them. The French Connection, as American law enforcement came to call it, continued operating for several more years after Antoine's death. New Corsican families, new chemists, the same routes. The system had outlasted its founders. On the American end of that pipeline, the heroin moved into the hands of the 5 New York crime families, and from there into neighborhoods. The connection was not abstract. It was a supply chain as organized as any legitimate import business, and far more profitable, which brings us to a figure on the opposite end of that world. Not French, not Corsican, Irish. Danny Greene, Cleveland, Ohio. A man who had nothing to do with the French Connection, but whose story illuminates something essential about how the American underworld actually worked. Greene was a longshoreman turned union boss turned mob associate. He became known, feared even, for his willingness to challenge the Italian-American families that dominated organized crime in the American Midwest. He called himself the Celtic Club. He put a Celtic knot on his door. He was not subtle. Between 1975 and 1977, at least 3 attempts were made on Danny Greene's life. He survived all of them. Cars were bombed. He walked away. A pipe bomb failed to detonate. He laughed. He developed, among the Cleveland underworld, a reputation that was almost mythological. The Cleveland mob bosses, recorded on FBI surveillance, discussed Greene with a frustration that bordered on disbelief. One of them was heard saying,
"This guy is not normal. Every time he walks away."
They were not wrong. But on October 6, 1977, the Cleveland families succeeded. A car bomb, planted in a vehicle adjacent to Greene's dentist's office, detonated as he walked to his car. Danny Greene was killed instantly. He was 43 years old. What followed was unexpected. The murder of Danny Greene triggered one of the largest FBI organized crime investigations in American Midwest history. Cooperating witnesses, surveillance recordings, a cascade of indictments. The attempt to kill one man had destabilized an entire criminal organization. The trial that emerged from Greene's murder and the subsequent FBI investigation resulted in convictions for multiple senior figures in the Cleveland crime family. The boss, the underboss, several lieutenants. It was the beginning of what federal prosecutors called the dismantling of organized crime in Cleveland. One man's death, an institution unraveled. 2 stories, 2 continents, 2 different decades. The Guérinis built a system so durable it outlasted them. Danny Greene built a reputation so disruptive it outlasted him too, but differently. His death broke something. Their deaths changed nothing. The machine kept running. That is the central lesson of the French Connection, and of the world Danny Greene briefly threatened to overturn. Criminal systems do not depend on individuals. They depend on structure, on supply chains, on compromised institutions, on the silence of people who know and say nothing. The French Connection was eventually dismantled, largely through a joint American and French operation in the early 1970s. Antoine Guérini had been dead for years by then. His name appeared in almost none of the press coverage. The system he built was front-page news. He was a footnote. That is how it works. The men who build the machine are rarely the ones who appear in the history books. The machine gets the headlines. The men disappear into the harbor fog.